Time. Time. The answer is time.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello, and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. If you watched the previous video on this channel, you'll know Suzanne recorded an argument with Barry on her spy pen. In part of that argument, Barry says something really crucial. If you want your money, I'm going to pay you back. And that was on bottom of page 29 of the 129-page redacted affidavit. If we read the full thing, Suzanne said, it's all about money. 80% of our arguments are because of money. It's money, it's about money. And then about an hour, 17 minutes, I think that's into the argument, Barry said, if you want your money, I'm going to pay you back. I'm going to make plenty of money. How is he going to make plenty of money? Bear in mind, all of this seemed to be taking place in the middle of COVID. In any event, in that simple sentence recorded in March 2020, Barry acknowledges that he had Suzanne's money. And further, we see that Suzanne had begun to express her displeasure in notes and then directly as well to Barry about arguing constantly over money. The important questions to ask around this are, A, what was the size and scale of the financial narrative? How much did Barry owe? Are we talking tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions? And B, what did Barry do after Suzanne disappeared? And how quickly did he do it? And we're asking those questions specifically in terms of the finances. Now, before we get to the micro view, I want to take you quickly through the macro view. The macro view is kind of the global way that we look at the timeline and this case. I do hope, especially over the course of the last few episodes, you've picked up a pattern in terms of our analysis. We've essentially been interrogating the timeline and more specifically, the past, that aspect of the timeline. So it's important to be able to see what we are doing kind of in a global sense so that we can see what we are not looking at and also what areas to focus on. So we started with the ripples of time immediately preceding Suzanne's disappearance, but we haven't been shy to go back additional days, then additional months, and then even decades. What we want to do by moving back and forth along the spectrum of time is pick up patterns in those ripples and more, see whether those patterns agitate, whether they are reinforced as we get closer to the denouement. Incidentally, while we are populating the timeline, while we are getting various perspectives from various keyholes at different points in the timeline, we are also getting to know these people a lot more intimately. We're also finding out who are some of the ancillary characters beyond the key characters. Obviously, the characters at the center of this are Suzanne and Barry, but there are other characters as well. Jeff Libler, Sheila Oliver, and there are more people we still need to encounter and get to know and add to our files. We'll do that in due course. But do you see in sum how powerful the timeline is in simply building up our knowledge base and our narrative? This becomes the narrative of the affidavit, but it's essentially a skeletal framework that builds progressively into a person. It's the bones of Moffat suddenly coming back to life as a real person, and as a result of paying a lot of attention to what she was doing over a long period of time. And so it is necessarily a study in attention to detail. It's not, snap, I know what happened. It's not, here's a fragment, a tranquilizer dart, oh, shocking, we've solved the case. No, it takes time to uncover the timeline. You may also have noticed we've spent most of our time diving down into the fluctuating depths of the past. And that's where the fishes of premeditation congregate and circle. What we want to do now is jump across that crucial red line, the line where Suzanne's life force is now no longer present, and look at what I call the post-meditation. You won't hear anyone else use that term because it's a uniquely TCRS term, a true crime rocket science-ism, if you will. And so if we take that detail that was so hard to get, they had to find the spy pen, they had to find Suzanne's messages with Jeff, find the right Jeff, but then also find an argument on the pen. And then the question is, how important were these arguments about money? How serious were these arguments? And one simple way to answer that question is, how much money are we talking about? Also, was the amount of money becoming more and more over time? Also, were the financial pressures becoming more and more over time? Bear in mind the Morphew girls were about to go to college. Suzanne had very expensive cancer treatments taking place. Suzanne had inherited $500,000. They were buying houses and trying to sell houses simultaneously, houses that were worth around about $1 million a piece. So, or was this just couples being couples? You could say, all couples argue about money at some point. Was it something like that, easy to be dismissed? So how serious were the arguments about money? And that then brings us to the question, were they serious enough to be potentially part of a motive here? So by going into the aftermath and drilling into the financial narrative, we may get a potential answer to that question. Is money potentially the motive here? And so let's see if the affidavit sheds any light onto this via a section titled Barry's Liquidation of Assets. How do you think that started? And how big do you think these assets are? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. According to my statistics, around 45.8% of you who watch this channel regularly are not subscribed. If you're not getting notifications, you probably want to check whether you've got notifications turned on. One way to do that is you can unsubscribe, resubscribe, and hit that notification bell. If you're new to me, my name's Nick, and I've written about 4 different cases set in Colorado, but multiple books, series of trilogies. If you add all of those books together, it must be more than 20 books. So I do know the landscape and to some extent the cultural fabric fairly well. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So now we're going to take the micro view. Now we're going to look at the, as I call it, the post-meditation, which is after Suzanne was dead, after Suzanne had disappeared from the picture. What happened? What is the financial narrative after that? And so we go to page 45 in the affidavit in a section dealing with Barry's liquidation of assets. Within a month of Suzanne's disappearance, Barry began to liquidate the assets. Would you say that that is quite quick? No, the impression you're getting is that Barry is grieving, like right now is grieving so much that he can't actually say anything. And the same thing when Suzanne first disappeared. He's grieving so much that he can't really do anything. And yet, look at what is taking place behind the scenes. Barry begins to liquidate assets. This started on June 1st, 2020, which is, if you think about it, it's barely 3 weeks after Suzanne disappears. And so what happened is Barry petitioned for guardianship in Hamilton County, Indiana, of Suzanne for him to act as her guardian. This filing allowed Barry to sign documents on Suzanne's behalf and sell their residences in Indiana and Colorado. Now, if you think about it, they've been holding on to the residences probably to get fair value for it. And now Barry wants to basically, perhaps accelerate that whole thing. And of course, in a scenario where you don't need to share the proceeds, well, now each person might be getting a larger amount relative to what it would have been. So somebody filed consent for the guardianship, and below are some screenshots of those court documents. So I think one simple way of asking this question is, who benefits from Suzanne suddenly disappearing from the scene? And then also, who did benefit? And you can also ask it more specifically. Did Barry benefit financially from Suzanne's disappearance? And then also, how much money are we talking about? Well, let's look at that. On June 6, 2020, Barry closed on the 26040 Cal Carson Road, Arcadia, Indiana property with a closing price of $750,000. So he's moved pretty quickly. On June 1st, he tries to get guardianship. 5 days later, he closes on the Indiana property. Your affiant served Bank of the West a search warrant for accounts associated to Barry and Suzanne, and then it refers to, there's a deposit dated February 24 for $40,000 from Monex. On June 19, there's a check written to Barry Morphew, and the signer appears to be blank in the amount of $30,000. Now, Monex comes up in Suzanne's list of grievances. It cites a transaction such as this one involving Monex, and she involves one. She mentions one involving somebody to Libler shortly before she disappears. That part's redacted. On July 1, so this is now about a month and 3 weeks, Ken Townsend told your affiant that so that was that date. On June 25th, Barry paid $160,000 for the Lot 8 property at Longhorn Ranch in Salida. Barry sold this back to Townsend on February 17, 2021 for $150,000. So Barry buys a lot of property and then sells it back at a loss of $10,000. So I don't know what you think. Do you think these amounts are small? $750,000, $40,000, $30,000, $160,000. And now let's go on July 13, 2020, Barry initiated a title change for Suzanne's Range Rover, selling it to Troy and Elizabeth Riley of Deputy, Indiana on July 16, 2020. That's pretty quick to be pretty certain that Suzanne's not coming back. She disappears in May, and basically 2 months later, Barry sold her vehicle. And I think one's going to compare that to, for example, the Scott Peterson case, where Scott sold Lacey's vehicle fairly early on, and also possibly the Chris Watts case, where his wife Shanann had a vehicle that they possibly couldn't afford because he was Googling vehicles at the time that this happened as well. Anyway, on March 3rd, 2021, the Recorder's Office in Salida informed your affiant that they just received a special warranty deed that 19057 Puma Path had sold to Mountain Renewal for $1,625,000. Now, if you add that amount, and it is quite a long time later, it's almost a year later, but if you add that to the sale of the Indiana property, well, then we are going over $2 million. And so if you're talking about, are we dealing with large amounts of money where greed could be a factor, what do you think? What is your opinion on that? So that brings us to this idea of intertextuality. Greed is a motive for murder more often than you might think. Scott Peterson, he was failing at his job as a fertilizer salesman. His wife had inherited money and jewelry. It's quite a large amount, I think $100,000 to $150,000 worth. He was selling Lacey's Croton jewel watch at the time that all of this was taking place. Anyway, Chris Watts, he couldn't afford his lifestyle or a divorce, and he wanted to keep the proceeds from the house. And I mean, he's going to need money to be in to remain in the affair he was in. Patrick Frazee, he had a $72,000 loan that was about to mature. Frazee lived with his mother. Alex Murdoch, well, we know that story all too well. Laurie Vallow, the untold story of Laurie Vallow, of the Laurie Vallow case, is, in a sense, how much money she stole or tried to steal from each person she had murdered, including her own children. So whatever you think the motive was in the Laurie Vallow case, money was also part and parcel of every single one. And then you could also even say JonBenet Ramsey and Madeleine McCann. Was money a motive in those cases? And before you dismiss that question, take a moment to think about it. Perhaps think about it in a way that you haven't before. So I'm not going to take it further than that. I hope you found it interesting, this idea of taking the premeditation past the incident and into the post-meditation, and do they line up, right? And then also ask the question, are the amounts of money significant that one would be talking about greed as a motive, greed as significant enough to reach that level of motive? What do you think? I'm not going to take it further than that. I have done some really interesting research that kept me up all night on the JonBenet Ramsey case, so look out for that. I'll be putting that up in a couple of hours. We may well be seeing a breakthrough in the Ramsey case before the end of this 27th year. It's possible. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.